Hello and welcome to Newsmax TV. I'm Paul Chicatano. Joining us via Skype is Dr. Matthew Bunson, senior correspondent for our Sunday Visitor and author of more than 45 books, including his latest, Pope Francis, the first English language biography of the popular new head of the Catholic Church. Dr. Bunson, welcome to Newsmax TV.
Thank you. It's great to be with you again.
While Pope Francis appears to be quite different from his predecessor, you don't necessarily expect Francis to be radically different when it comes to Catholic doctrine. Where will this Pope make his mark?
Yeah, I think you've hit on an important aspect of this particular pontificate, and that is one of the watchwords for this is continuity. We're seeing that already in how he's carrying forward a lot of the programs of Pope Benedict XVI. But where he's making his mark, I think, is twofold. One is in his remarkable style of being Pope. We're seeing that already with his humility, with his outreach, with those little acts of service, and also with some of his remarkable homilies that we should probably talk a little bit about. The other area, I think, is going to be one of reform. We're already seeing his determination to bring about reform in the central government of the Church called the Roman Curia. And that's going to have significant impact, I think, on the Church in the coming years. In making the central government much more responsive to the needs of the Pope in order to make him more effective as a minister, as a servant to the whole Church. The other area I think that we're already starting to see is a real globalization of what was a central enterprise of the last couple of decades under Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI, and that's called the New Evangelization.
Now, you conducted research in 5 different languages in writing your book. What was the biggest surprise you came across?
By far, it was the homilies of then Cardinal Jorge Mario Bergoglio. We were aware that he was a very prominent figure in the life of Latin America and the life of Argentina, and then, of course, in the city of Buenos Aires, where he was the Archbishop. His homilies, though, were incredible reading in their original Spanish, in large measure because of his pastoral style. But also, he's very humble. We've seen that already, but he's also very fiery. He reminds me very much of some of the early fathers of the church, as they're called, in the first centuries of Christianity, in speaking out against the corruption of the times, against pagan, materialist, secular culture, relativism, a lot of the things that we're trying to deal with today in sort of a post-Christian United States, post-Christian Europe. Cardinal Bergoglio was fierce in defending things like human dignity, in his defense of marriage, in his speaking out for the poor and the defenseless, and also, of course, the corruption of the times in exactly the same way that a lot of these church fathers, we see that in St. Augustine, we see that in St. John Chrysostom, for example, spoke out in their time. So that was one of the great surprises, and in a way, a great pleasure to read his homilies.
Now, Pope Francis has already said he wants the Catholic Church to act decisively to root out sexual abuse of children by priests. How important is it for Francis to tackle this issue early on?
I think it sent an important gesture. It was an important symbol. It was an announcement to the Church that there's no going back from the reforms of Pope Benedict XVI. I know that my colleague and co-author of a book on Pope Benedict and the sexual abuse crisis, Greg Erlinson, has been a guest on Newsmax a number of times talking about that very issue of the sexual abuse of minors and how the Church is dealing with it. Pope Francis, and he was still Cardinal Jorge Mario Bergoglio, was very clear in his support of Pope Benedict's zero-tolerance policy toward abusers, toward making sure that the seminaries have proper formation programs. So as Pope, he's made absolutely clear that he has no intention of allowing the Church to backtrack on any of that, and he's really determined to push ahead with all of the reforms, I think, that Pope Benedict put in place, and that we're seeing really coming to fruition now across the universal Church.
Well, the Catholic Church this week excommunicated a Brazilian priest for defending homosexuality, open marriage, and other practices counter to church teachings.
Yeah.
Do you anticipate that Francis will soften the Church's stance on social issues?
No. In fact, if you read his homilies, especially as the Archbishop of Buenos Aires, he was very clear in his defense of marriage, in his defense certainly of natural law as it pertains to marriage and family life, and really the whole package of social issues that are of great concern to the church, relating as they do to human dignity and the defense of the human person, as the human person is authentically created. So Pope Francis, I think, is going to surprise a lot of people with the degree to which he's willing to defend things like family life, a marriage, and of course he's very outspoken in the area of abortion. So I don't anticipate any changes along those lines.
What about the Pope's stand on women priests? A 70-year-old Kentucky woman was ordained on Saturday by a dissident group, while 70% of U.S. Catholics believe that women should be allowed to serve.
Yeah, again, I don't anticipate that Pope Francis will be making any changes in matters of doctrine, such as we've seen. The issue of women priests is one, of course, that we've seen over the last number of years. It's notable that many of the women priests who are being so-called ordained women priests, in many cases, aren't even Catholic. So this is an issue, I think, that ties in to some of these other major issues, such as homosexual marriage and abortion, in which voices largely outside the church, major cultural influences, are trying to impose their will on the teachings of the church. And I would anticipate that Pope Francis will be very clear and very firm in upholding the teachings of the church in the face of what he has already called, in quoting Pope Benedict XVI, the dictatorship of relativism. The idea that there are no standards, that the standards are what we choose to make them, certainly in the area of natural law. So, no, I would not anticipate that Pope Francis will be changing anything regarding that.
Israeli President Shimon Peres has invited the Pope to visit Israel. Is Francis likely to try to use his world stage to broker a peace deal?
Yes, that is one of the great hallmarks, of course, of the papacy, especially in modern times. We have seen over the decades, we saw it with Pope John Paul II in brokering peace agreements, I think, for example, of the conflict between Argentina and Chile in the early 1980s. The Holy See has been for a very long time and remains very much a neutral arbiter, somebody that everyone in conflict can turn to in crises to bring about a fair negotiation. I think that Pope Francis will carry that forward. He has already established himself in the model of St. Francis of Assisi as somebody who wants peace, who brings that humility of service. And I think many people will be turning to him to assist in brokering disagreements and conflicts. Again, in exactly the same way that the popes of the modern era have stood as figures of peace. So yeah, I would be surprised, in fact, if the Holy See does not have a say or is not in some way a participant in whatever sort of negotiations take place in the Middle East. Again, if for no other reason than we have a stake as a church, as a faith, in what happens in the Middle East because of the Christian presence there, because this is the Holy Land, this is the place where Christ walked and taught, and of course died and in Catholic teaching rose from the dead. So there is that investment as well on the part of the church.
Well, the head of the ultra-traditionalist Society of St. Pius X has been critical of the Pope's man-centered philanthropy. Does this bode well for a reconciliation of the million-follower sect?
Well, I think that we saw under Pope Benedict XVI many efforts to effect a real reunion with, for example, the members of the Society of St. Pius X. Some progress was certainly made. We saw the lifting of the excommunication of the leadership of the society, controversial lifting as it turns out. My suspicion is that Pope Francis will continue to push forward in trying to bring them back. But much has to be done, I think, in the area of agreement, especially in trying to get them to recognize the teachings, especially of the Church, in light of the Second Vatican Council. It always now centers less on their arguments over the Latin Mass, which is sort of the big ticket item that people have been talking about for decades, and more on the Church's understanding of herself, what is called ecclesiology, coming out of the Second Vatican Council. So that's going to be a major obstacle. In that sense, I think we have some ways to go with the traditionalists.
Much has been made of this Pope's pledge to create a church that's poor in spirit.
Yeah.
What does he mean by this?
Yeah, this is a phrase that we're hearing quite a bit about, and there are two aspects to that I think are worth talking about. The first is capturing the poverty of spirit that existed certainly in the early church. In one of his homilies just a few days ago, he commented on the fact that the early Christians went out into the world as a result of those first persecutions with very little. They had the most meager of their possessions, and yet they had the courage to go out to proclaim the gospel. He calls this apostolic courage, the idea to trust enough. And it's one of the things that he's calling the church to do, and that is to trust in simplicity, to trust in humility and service, to be poor in spirit, to have that trust in the Holy Spirit, to be Christ-like. But he's also used the phrase of those who are spiritually poor, those who are impoverished in the spirit. And in that sense, he's talking about something else entirely, and that would be so many in the first world who are awash in material prosperity, in money, in riches, in houses, and yet they are themselves impoverished. They do not have that relationship with Christ, that friendship with Christ, to use the phrase that Pope Benedict XVI did. So being poor in spirit, in a way, is the way for the church to move forward in the modern world, to call the modern world to what it's really asked to be. And that, of course, then, is to deal with the crisis of those who are impoverished in spirit, which, of course, is something else entirely.
Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI is moving back into the Vatican this week. Some church scholars worry that he could become a lightning rod for conservatives if Francis goes too far. Is this a valid concern?
Yeah, I do not agree with that for two reasons. One, I'm not sure what they mean by if Francis goes too far, and I'm not disagreeing with you. What I mean is that Francis stands, as we have seen in the nearly 2 months of his pontificate, very much in continuity with the teachings of both Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI in a host of areas, as you and I have been talking. We've already seen that Francis is a pope who is very much at ease with himself. He's very comfortable being pope. He demonstrated that from almost the moment of his election. He visited Pope Benedict XVI at Castel Gandolfo. And now that Pope Benedict is coming back to the Vatican to live, we know the circumstances of his arrangement there. That's going to be one of prayerful meditation, one of seclusion from the world. The last person that would want to interfere or to become a lightning rod in this new pontificate would be the Pope Emeritus, the Bishop of Rome Emeritus, and that's Pope Benedict XVI. He's made that very clear. On the day that he left the Vatican, on February 28th, and one of the last public statements that he made to the members of the College of Cardinals who were preparing to elect his successor, he said very forcefully that he pledged there and then his fidelity and his obedience to the new Pope. And that, I think, is the model that everyone in the church should follow. And there may be those who complain about styles that are different, approaches that are different, but all they have to do is look at the retired Pope, the Pope Emeritus, to understand where they need to go. If they're truly faithful to Benedict, then they have to be obedient and faithful to Francis as well.
Our guest today was Dr. Matthew Bunson, senior correspondent for our Sunday Visitor and author of the new book, Pope Francis. Dr. Bunson, thank you for joining us on Newsmax TV.
Thanks so much for having me. God bless.